So you're thinking of moving away from the ketogenic diet and in this plant-based direction. There are common mistakes that I see time and time again with any diet transition, but I think this one is so notable, so remarkable, because the two approaches can be, not always, but it really depends on your approach, but they certainly can be polar opposites. So of course, there are very unique patterns and trends here, shown by those who transition in this way. So in this video, I'd like to break some of those down for you right now. I'd like to give you the key components to your success making this transition smoothly. Let's dive in. So the first point of note here, it's not uncommon for new plant-based dieters of a low-carb background to experience some initial weight gain at first. Note I put the stress on weight gain, I didn't say fat gain, the two are not one and the same, although if we have gained weight, it is a likely indicator that we have indeed gained fat, but it's not quite that binary is what I'm trying to indicate here. And when we move, of course, from a radically low carb approach, to one that is naturally high in carbohydrates. Now, under the plant-based umbrella, you can have a higher fat approach, you can have a higher protein approach, for instance. But typically, because so many of these plant foods, such as the whole grains, the beans, the fruits, and the veggies, are so high in carbohydrates naturally, and by the way, that's not something to automatically be fearful of, but they're so naturally high in carbohydrates, we could well increase, we're likely to skyrocket the amount of glycogen in our system. That's going to increase water retention. The body, in layman's terms, is going to hold on to more water there. And within the first couple of days, that could well increase the numbers we're seeing on the scales in a way that isn't necessarily indicative of fat gain. So that's really important to know. Sometimes we'll jump on the scales, think, oh my goodness, I've gained weight, I must be doing something wrong with my diet. Maybe we go back to the keto approach, maybe we radically change a plant-based approach that could actually have great potential for us because we see this initial gain. And I suppose what I'm trying to highlight here is, though there could be some validity to the assessment that you're doing something wrong early on to this thought process, it could well be that you've merely gained weight as a result of increased water retention. Now, we can hold on to more water in the body as well because of sodium retention and whatnot, various other factors. Women have this at the time of the month as well. So there's several variables that can really throw off our sound conclusions here. So also be aware of that. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, it's wise to be a little bit patient and keep it in your mind, rather, I suppose, when making this transition that, yeah, remember that one video where Ryan said the body's likely to hold on to a lot more water because of the increased carbohydrate intake? Could also well be that you're eating more volume as well, because high-fat meals on a ketogenic style approach will absolutely yield less volume per calorie versus a high carbohydrate plant-based approach, if you can picture that in your mind's eye, because of the calorie makeup of those foods. And so, very interestingly, it could well be that you're eating a lot more in terms of your food intake, and therefore there's more food in your system. So when you're stepping on the scales, that's also increasing the number. Now, these are very fine margins, but totted up in one's mind, you can easily see why people might get confused or paranoid about why they've gained that initial weight. So just know that it could well be down to water retention. It's not always the case, but this could well be the case for you. Number two, the steps you take when you transition here are ultimately predicated on what your goals are. It depends what you're looking to achieve in terms of what I can actually advise here. Perhaps you have ambitions to get in the gym, maybe gain some weight, gain a little bit of muscle and so on. Perhaps you're looking to slim down. Perhaps you're looking for a toned physique. It really depends on what you're looking to achieve. Also, it's going to depend on fitness pursuits as well. Perhaps you're somebody particularly fitness-minded, and then maybe there is an argument to be made that you need to be somewhat conscious of protein intake too, of course, when moving in this plant-based direction. So yeah, various things to consider based on what your goals are ultimately. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here based on my average viewer and their goals. It's likely you're coming to this channel because you do want to lose weight. Well, ultimately, as binary as I'm about to make it, it is largely going to come down to this calorie issue. There is a huge argument for the role of hormones in weight loss as well, but quite simply, it's very likely that it's going to come down to a calorie issue for you personally. And so, ultimately, when moving in this plant-based direction, I suppose it's wise that we don't go too crazy with the calories anyway. Now, we do, of course, have the role of the negative calorie effect to consider as well, which is a huge rabbit hole, and I've been meaning to make a video on this subject for a while, so make sure you hit the subscribe button down below to stay up to date with when I release that video. But ultimately, it is, to put it in binary terms, to make it very black and white here, it is going to come down to the calorie equation. And so if we're moving from keto to plant-based, we want to make sure our calories are somewhat consistent, again, depending on what our goals are. So ultimately, consider what your goals are here, what you're looking to achieve, and that's going to dictate your particular plant-based strategy, because under the plant-based umbrella, perhaps you've already heard of all these different sub-diets. Perhaps you've heard of raw vegan, perhaps you've heard of the starch solution, perhaps you've heard of Dr. Furman's work, this nutritarian approach, and so you're somewhat confused about where to get started with this. Well, this is largely going to be predicated on your goals, I would argue, okay? Some of these diets are better than others, I think, objectively, but also when we factor in your goals, it might change the particular tactics you take. Another piece of advice is, and you've got to tweak for you. So often when moving in this plant-based direction, you discover these resources and bits of content online. It's very likely that an 80-10-10 style approach is going to be what's recommended. If you're not familiar with that terminology, that is simply a macronutrient breakdown of one's calories and how they are attributed rather to those big three macronutrients. So 80% carbohydrates in this case, 10% fat, 10% protein. Now, if you're coming from a keto approach, the first thing you'll likely be thinking as you're watching this and hearing me explain that 80-10-10 approach is that your fat intake is going to go down considerably from where it was at before. So it might be for you that you do these things in increments. I mean, having 10% of your overall calories, coming from fat, it's isolated, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I argue that that is, for most people, far too low. Not far too low an amount, but too low an amount generally. Although, again, that depends on so many different variables. So anyway, maybe I'm trying to place my head in somebody that's coming from a very ketogenic style approach. Might be wise to take this down in increments. It also might be wise to not start with an 80-10-10 style approach, but more maybe 60% carbohydrates, 25% from fat, the rest from protein, and doing it that way. So important to remember that these things, they're not set in stone, they are templates, and they are good templates for a reason, but nonetheless they are still templates. And I say that even with my videos in mind. You can check out my videos on macronutrient breakdown. In fact, on that subject, I'll link one down below. That'll be handy for you. But please, even with that, please use it merely as a template and adjust and tweak for you. Now, clearly there is rather scientifically, medically speaking, does seem as though there is an optimal diet for us. But even within that, there is somewhat of an argument to be made for case by case, a tiny bit of trial and error to make things work for you, to tweak for you, again, based on your goals, your preferences, what you actually feel good doing as well. It's really important to consider weight training as well. So I know a lot of people that follow this ketogenic or maybe even a paleo style approach, and I'm very well aware of the differences between the two. But for the purpose of explaining what I'm about to explain, I'll put them in the same category. Very aware that a lot of people that eat with that sort of ideology are into strength training and weight training. So it might be that you need to be somewhat protein conscious. And I say somewhat because I do think there is a touch of scaremongering, and that's probably putting it lightly, but a touch of scaremongering that goes on when people talk about vegan, vegetarian, plant-based diets. Where are we going to get the protein? What are you going to do about this? Blah, 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 blah. And yeah, I do think some of that is scaremongering. But at the same time, you know, if you are athletic, if you are even breastfeeding as well, maybe there's an argument to be made there that you do need to think somewhat consciously about protein rather than merely just eating plant foods and hoping that the protein works out all right, which it will for the vast majority of people anyway. But as I say, if there is a focus here on athletic fitness, certainly weightlifting pursuit anyway, or you're breastfeeding, it is absolutely worth being somewhat conscious, is the way to put it, of your protein intake, So we're thinking lots of beans, lots of legumes, things like tofu, tempeh. People often ask my opinion on protein powder. Again, I don't think it's a necessity. I would rather you eat whole foods, but to get a hit of protein without also having so much of the carbs and the fat, which you would likely get from eating whole foods on a plant-based approach, it's very likely that, well, it is most certainly the case that when you eat something that's protein rich on a plant-based diet like beans, that you're also getting a bunch of carbs too. So to get that hit of protein from a refined protein powder could be useful to you. I don't think it's necessary. So again, consider your goals. Also have a plan, okay? So I'll link a video based, or a couple of videos based on meal plans, beginner guides for getting started with a plant-based diet down below, so you have a plan for going forward. If you just go into this, excuse my language here, but willy-nilly, if you go into this willy-nilly with no plan of action, no framework for how you're going to eat, if you wake up on a morning and you're not sure what you're going to eat today and you're scrambling the internet for recipes just before you're about to start cooking, could well be a big mistake. You need to have a plan of action ahead, and you need to keep that in mind rather. Get yourself a grocery list, so when you go to the supermarket, you know what you're buying because you know what you're eating. You've got a plan of action. That's really key. So I'll link some videos with basic meal plans down below for you to get started with. And I think my final note here is arguably my most important. It's likely, because these diets are very much polar opposite in terms of the overall diet spectrum, let's say, it's very likely that you're going to have some interesting inner battles to face here, some inner battles to tackle. Your story, your narrative is likely radically changing. If you're not familiar too much with my background story, to sum it up really here, classic gym dude. I had a skinny fat physique growing up as a teenager, wanted to do something about it, got in the gym, became such a gym bro, protein shakes, chicken breast 3 times a day, tuna, you can imagine it all. Crazy sort of like bodybuilder-esque, I wasn't a bodybuilder, but bodybuilder-esque approach. Very boring, chicken, a little bit of rice, maybe some broccoli, so on and so forth. You can imagine it all. But with that as well, I still had some serious addictions for junk foods. I've spoken before on this channel about my Domino's and Ben & Jerry pizza nights. Ultimately, when I first went plant-based, such a conflicting story based on what I was doing before. I was such a calorie counter before. I also did a flexible dieting approach for some time as well. So this was a radical shift I was making to eating lots of these fiber-rich whole plant foods. And I also went vegan as well, so it wasn't just going plant-based, I also went fully vegan with it for the ethical side of things too. And so, as you can imagine, this is a radical change in one's personal and social identity. So for me, there was a lot of conflicting inner battles, and it didn't take long actually for me to get over those, so perhaps I'm exaggerating that there. I don't think there were that many in hindsight. But initially, I had an awful lot of resistance to a plant-based diet. I certainly remember that because my ego was like, no, Ryan, you don't believe in this. This is a and as a result, I had such a bias against it. And then in time, I opened myself up to it, did my own research, saw that saw the myriad of benefits of it. And then, of course, with taking action on it and seeing results, that confirmed my suspicions, that confirmed my thoughts, and that led to a real change in my identity, my value system surrounding my particular approach to nutrition, let's say. So it's wise that you also remember, I suppose, going into this, the role of the ego, how it's going to perhaps resist the change that you're about to make here, and how that's going to make it a little bit more of a struggle. Just know that, so when you go into this, you can somewhat objectively, it's very difficult to do, but somewhat objectively say, I know why I've got a problem with this particular thing. I know why 1 week in here I'm thinking about going back to keto. I know where that thought's coming from. It's the old ego. It's perhaps my conflicting stories and identities of the past. So remember that too. I think that's really important. So anyway, in summary, I hope you got some very valuable advice from this. I suppose to recap, my best advice here is remember that initial weight gain, because that can really throw people off very early on. Again, that's really only going to affect the 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 day mark. You're going to noticeably see that early on. If you're still seeing that at weeks 1 or 2, and the scale is still going up and up, you can't merely attribute that to water retention. That is likely fat gain, or it's very largely going to be fat gain, unless you're taking anabolic steroids or something like that completely distorts things. It's very likely to be fat gain. So also remember that ultimately this is going to depend on what your goals are. Tweak for you, have a plan of action going forward, and remember the change in stories and identities and how your belief and value system is going to change. And that will happen in time with consistent action, but there's going to be, I suppose, a period of time here where you're going to have a lot of these inner struggles based on what you're doing in the past, and you're still waiting for the results to come on a plant-based diet, because things don't happen overnight ultimately, and you're thinking, oh, is it going to work for me? Is it going to work for me? There's going to be an awful awful lot of self-doubt there, you could well talk yourself out of the actions you're taking. So in summary, hope you got a lot of value from this video. Smash that like button if you did indeed, and if you're new to this channel, make sure you hit subscribe. For more help transitioning to a plant-based diet, check out my book, Natural Food's the Only Diet You Need. That is my blueprint to weight loss success there, outlines the basic principles of these methodologies that I share in these videos of mine. Great place to get started. I'll link it in the description box down below, or you can merely head over to naturalweightlossmastery.com and check it out there. Thanks for your time.